Hey everyone, Benchy here from Benching&Gaming. I thought I'd try something a little bit different for the video today and actually include myself, so please be kind. But today we're going to be testing this, the HD 4550, specifically the 512MB GDDR3 version, which launched in September 2008. But just how does an 11-year-old card perform in relatively modern games today? Stay tuned to find out. The HD 4550, as mentioned, launched in September of 2008 and was part of the same entry-level market segment as the HD 4350 and 4570. With a maximum power draw of around 25 watts, it ran at a core speed of 600 MHz, with the 512MB of GDDR3 memory on this version of the 4550 running at 667 MHz, 1334 MHz effectively, with some using 800 MHz GDDR3 instead. It was built using the Terascale architecture and featured 242 million transistors built on the 55nm fabrication process. The RV710 graphics core had 1 compute unit, 80 shading units, 8 texture mapping units and 4 raster operations pipelines, and had 16 KB of L1 cache, with 64 KB of L2 cache as well. This version of the 4550 specifically had 1 DVI connector, 1 HDMI connector and also 1 VGA connector as well, but given that it is a low profile card, you can actually remove the VGA connector and fit a low profile bracket instead for small form factor PCs. Price wise, I'm unsure of the exact price, but the version we have here today launched back in 2008 at a price of around $55 US, which is around $65 today, adjusting for inflation, or around £52 or €58 minus any taxes etc. With the 256MB version of this card coming in around $10 cheaper than the 512MB launch price. As I mentioned though, I managed to buy this for only £4 at CEX in the UK, and on eBay.com in America, for the version with the same video outputs as this one, you'd be paying $12.99. Before we get on with the tests, here's a quick rundown of the system we'll be testing the 4550 with. It features an i7 6700K at 4.8 GHz on all cores, a MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard, 16GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 at 2800 MHz, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit, with the games running from a mechanical hard drive. So let's get on with the test. Kicking off our test for today is the ever popular Grand Theft Auto 5, a now 4-year-old game, on the PC at least, that remains a great game for benchmarking processors and graphics cards today. 720p was nowhere near being remotely playable in any way, so I decided to run the test at the lowest resolution possible, 800 by 600. I'd actually forgotten about the frame scaling option, so the resolution could go down to an effective 400 by 300 if you'd like. I'm also using the lowest possible settings for this test as well, to at least give the 4550 a chance at being playable. That was nothing more than a distant pipe dream though, unfortunately, as the performance was truly awful. Throughout the city, the game could only manage around the 13 to 20 frames per second mark, and had input lag so hilariously bad that the driving was made near impossible to do. It did lessen the further out of the built-up city areas you got though. I also noticed a fair amount of input locking as well, where whatever input you were doing, say turning left for example, would stick on for a period of time. Performance out in the desert area was no better, although the input locking wasn't as bad as it was in the city, but overall though, the game is completely unplayable in this state and should most certainly be avoided at this resolution. The benchmark showed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 19, 13 and 11 FPS respectively, with a lot of frame time spikes throughout the test of around 60 to 105 milliseconds and one of 120 milliseconds. Hoping for at least a playable experience, I moved on to CSGO, or Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Given the age of the game, it released 7 years ago now, I decided to test the game at 720p. I also managed to get the game to pick up a custom resolution of 848 by 480 as well. Both are being run using the lowest possible settings in a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map. 720p was, I'd say, unplayable at the worst and uncomfortable at best. FPS throughout the map did manage to be around 35 up to 58 FPS range, but the game had a sort of stuttery appearance throughout the test, which I'm certain is due to the frame times being very inconsistent. There was also a dip down to 27 FPS due to the smoke on screen as well. The inconsistent frame times unfortunately also caused some input lag, although unlike GTA 5 the inputs wouldn't lock, which I suppose was nice. 848x480 though was far smoother than 720p, and far more playable as well. It managed 59 up to around 105 frames per second throughout the map, and to my eye at least had no noticeable issues at all, and overall was quite enjoyable if you can put up with the low resolution. 720p managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 42, 23 and 18 FPS respectively, with multiple spikes in frame times of around 40 to 60 milliseconds, with a few more getting towards 100 milliseconds. 848x480 on the other hand managed 72, 42 and 31 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and had some frame time spikes of around 40 to 60 milliseconds. The next game up on the list is Skyrim, specifically the original version of the game, released back in 2011, not the remastered version released back in 2016. And much like CSGO, I decided to test the game at 720p as well as a custom resolution of 848x480, which I had to edit the Skyrim prefs.ini file to actually use. I'm also running the game using the low preset in the game's launcher. Performance-wise, 720p was pretty uncomfortable to play. It suffered from the exact same issues as CSGO at 720p, in that the frame times were quite inconsistent, which causes quite noticeable input lag at points through the game, and also causes it to have a stuttery appearance throughout as well. FPS wise, it only managed 20 to 29 FPS on the run into Riverwood near the start of the game, and even dipped as low as 18 FPS inside the Riverwood trader, making for some pretty jarring gameplay. 848x480 though managed a far smoother experience, with FPS in the 41 to 55 FPS range on the run into Riverwood, and stayed above 30 FPS inside the trader, with highs of 43 FPS. On the way towards Bleak Falls Barrow and the Temple, 720p couldn't even manage to hit 30 FPS here, and was often in the low to mid-20s, still with the noticeably stuttery appearance caused by the frame times, and the input lag that goes along with it. 848x480 fared far better on the run towards the Temple, dropping no lower than the mid-30s and hitting as high as around 51 FPS. Inside the Temple itself was a horror show for 720p, with figures as low as 14 FPS at one point. It did however manage a high of around 40, although that doesn't make up for just how jarring an experience it is. 848x480 again performed relatively well, with FPS in the range of 31 up to the game's hard limit of 60 FPS inside the Temple, although there were moments in which there was some noticeable stuttering, which happened when the FPS dipped into the 30s. 720p managed 25, 12 and 9 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with a huge amount of frame time spikes of around 60 to 90 milliseconds throughout the game, many more reaching 160 milliseconds and one hitting 220 milliseconds at one point. 848x480 managed 48, 28 and 21 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and had a lot of frame time spikes hitting up to 60 milliseconds, some around 100 milliseconds and one reaching 120 milliseconds. Lastly, before moving on to overclocking the HD 4550 is Warframe, a game initially released in 2013 but one that continues to be updated today and has a massive community of players as well. Now for this game I'm testing it at resolutions of 848x480 and 640x360, both of which are custom resolutions and required me to edit the game's configuration file to achieve. One thing to watch out for though, if you're doing it yourself, is that when setting the custom resolution to 640x360, the game can often start up in 640x480, giving you a squashed image, although Alt-tabbing out and back in can fix this. That aside, both tests are running with the low settings preset, and both were conducted in a survival mission on Jupiter. To start off with, I ran about the Landercraft for a bit, to get an idea of how it performs there. And at 848x480, the FPS was around the 38 to 80 FPS mark, depending on where you are on the ship, and there was no noticeable stuttering or locking up. 640x360 though managed as high as 100 frames per second, with lows around the 47 FPS mark. It also appeared to run smoothly on the planet selection screen as well, but 848x480 had a stuttery appearance and some input lag here, probably due to inconsistent frame times again. During the mission itself though, 848x480 could get to as high as a high 80s FPS wise during the mission in the least detailed areas, but had very noticeable dips down as low as 21 FPS with noticeable input lag as well. There was also one occasion where the inputs locked up, causing the gun to continue firing. 640x360 could also be quite jarring at times as well, but could hit as high as 104 FPS during the mission in the least detailed areas, with lows around the 29 FPS mark. There was also some noticeable input lag as well, although I don't think it was as bad as at 848x480, and overall 640x360 was a big improvement over what 848x480 could manage. The benchmark showed 40, 24 and 21 FPS for 848x480's average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with multiple spikes in frame times throughout of around 40 to 50 milliseconds, with one hitting 60 milliseconds. 640x360 though managed 54, 32 and 30 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and had spikes in frame times of around 40 milliseconds, with one hitting 100 milliseconds as well. Getting on to overclocking, and with GTA 5, the 4550 managed a maximum clock of 721 MHz on the core and 860 MHz on the memory, effectively 1720 MHz. An increase of 121 and 60 MHz respectively. The memory was unfortunately quite limited on how much I could increase the clock. That aside, there was a massive improvement over what stock clocks managed. FPS was now in the 18 to 28 FPS range throughout the city, which may not seem great, but the input lag was massively reduced, although there was still some noticeable input lag there, as well as a little input locking left over too. The frame times were unfortunately still quite inconsistent, which led to a stuttery appearance throughout the test again. Once out in the desert area of the map, there was again still some noticeable input locking, although that only happened occasionally. Benchmark wise, the 4550 managed 23, 16 and 13 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. Despite the low benchmark figures, considering an improvement over stock, I'd argue that this was actually now kind of playable if you can put up with the low FPS. Moving on to CSGO, and there was quite a noticeable improvement here as well. Clockwise, it managed speeds of 730 MHz on the core, with 860 MHz on the memory, and given how limited a card like this is in terms of memory bandwidth, I have a feeling that the 60 MHz increase in memory clock, despite how small it is where the majority of the performance boost is coming from. At stock, 720p had a pretty noticeable stuttery appearance throughout the map, and could be uncomfortable to play at times, and despite still having issues with this, the overclock managed to mostly do away with it. The FPS was now around the 45 to 73 FPS mark depending on where you are on the map, as well as the stuttery appearance still being noticeable at times. There was also some noticeable micro stuttering when turning the camera as well. 848x480 on the other hand could now manage 70 to 136 FPS throughout the map, depending on where on the map you are, and as you can imagine was far smoother than 720p could manage to be. There were no signs of any kind of input lag or locking, nor was there any kind of stutter or locking up either. There were dips down into the mid-60s though when there was smoke on screen, but that wasn't really any issue at all. 720p managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 53, 29 and 22 FPS respectively, with multiple spikes in frame times throughout the test of around 40 to 60 milliseconds, and some more around the 70 to 80 millisecond mark. I'd like to point out though that literally the moment the benchmark ended, the game black screened, so you may have to reduce the clocks a little as it seems it isn't entirely stable with this overclock. 848x480 managed 89, 52 and 39 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% frame rates respectively, which is a huge improvement over what it managed at stock. There were also multiple spikes in frame times of up to around 40 to 60 milliseconds, although these were unnoticeable. For the penultimate game in today's test, it's back to Skyrim. 848x480 is where the biggest improvement came with the overclock, and speaking of which, the HD 4550 managed clocks of 721 MHz on the core and 860 MHz on the memory. The run into Riverwood at the start of the game now had 720p hitting as high as 37 FPS, with lows of 27. There was also some noticeable stuttering when you run through the trees, and when turning the camera as well. 848x480 though never dropped below 48 FPS on the run into Riverwood, and would get as high as the game's hard limit of 60 FPS, which it often hit throughout the test. At this point, there was no input lag or stuttering of any kind at all at this resolution. The Riverwood trader showed a small improvement to 720p, with FPS now around the 24 to 30 FPS mark, although there was still a noticeably stuttery appearance to the game here, and there was still some input lag here too. 848x480 could manage 43 to 53 FPS here now, and unlike 720p, there was no noticeable stuttering or locking up in any way. Getting towards Bleak Falls Barrow had 720p dipping to as low as 21 FPS, with some pretty noticeable stuttering, with 848x480 managing to hit the 60 FPS limit with lows of 43 FPS, and again there was no stuttering or locking up here either. Inside Bleak Falls Temple is where it starts to get even worse, at least for 720p, as there were dips as bad as 21 FPS, and there was also some very noticeable stuttering, as well as dips below 20 FPS when there was a significant amount of fire on screen. To make it even worse, there was also a noticeable amount of input lag in the temple too, due to very inconsistent frame times. 848x480 thankfully fared far better in the temple. It was on the game's 60 FPS limit quite a lot, but there were however moments where it would dip to 39 FPS, with very noticeable micro stuttering when it happened. 720p's benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 32, 16 and 11 FPS respectively, which shows just how bad the stuttering got at times, along with the huge amount of spikes in frame times of up to 80 milliseconds, multiple hitting 100 milliseconds, and some more of 120 to 140 milliseconds. 720p also had the same issue here as it did in CSGO, in that the game black screened the moment the benchmark ended, so a reduction in clock speed would be needed to have the game be completely stable, not that the performance would be good enough to be comfortable anyway. 848x480 managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 56, 31 and 25 FPS respectively, with multiple frame time spikes throughout the test of around 50 to 60 milliseconds, a couple hitting 80 to 100 milliseconds, and one of 120 milliseconds. Despite the issues that remained, it was a decent improvement over stock, and would often be on the game's 60 FPS hard limit. Lastly is back to Warframe, which managed stable clocks of 730 MHz on the core, and 860 MHz on the memory, much like CSGO, minus the black screen at the end of the benchmark. 848x480 showed a noticeable improvement overall, and to an extent so did 640x360, although that resolution did in fact show slightly worse stutter according to the benchmark figures. On the Landercraft, the overclock pushed the FPS up to nearly 100 frames per second at 848x480, or even higher at 640x360 at 120 FPS max. Lows here were around 46 and 55 FPS respectively. The planet selection screen was far smoother at 848x480 now, although there were still some issues here with input lag, the same being true for 640x360, minus the input lag as it ran with no problems at that resolution with stock clocks already. Moving on to the mission itself though, and both still had issues with noticeable micro stuttering in the most intense scenes, with lots of enemies or smoke around you, with 848x480s being quite noticeable, which also may have had a slight slowdown in how fast the game was running, as I was sure the fire rate of the weapons seemed slower than it should have been. 640x360 never had this slowdown though. FPS wise, both would still dip below 30 FPS in intense scenes, with highs of around 103 to 108 FPS at 848x480, and almost 130 frames per second at 640x360 in the least detailed areas of the game. 848x480 also had some fairly noticeable input lag during the most intense scenes as well. 848x480 managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 46, 27 and 25 FPS respectively, with frame time spikes of up to around 50 milliseconds throughout, and some of 60 milliseconds. A small improvement over stock clocks, but not enough to make it completely comfortable to play. 640x360 on the other hand could manage relatively playable 58, 33 and 28 FPS, average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with some frame time spikes of around 40 to 60 milliseconds, and one of 70 milliseconds. There were also pretty much no spikes at all in the latter half of the test, other than one of 60 milliseconds. This was a slight improvement over stock clocks, but at times the stutter was actually a bit worse. So there you have it. The HD 4550 can in fact play some relatively modern games, albeit at pretty low resolutions, but given that it only cost me £4, £5.50 with postage and packaging, it's actually not that bad overall, because to me, you don't need great graphics or the best of hardware to still enjoy games. Reducing the frame scaling option in GTA 5 would hopefully make it more playable. CSGO at 848x480 ran reasonably well too, with an overclock. Warframe can be playable at 640x360 despite its remaining issues, and Skyrim ran remarkably well as well at 848x480 with an overclock despite the remaining issues, If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this. And maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon at patreon.com/Benching&Gaming or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Benching&Gaming. But thanks for watching my video. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.